When my cousin Dennis first suggested I put this show together, I thought, well, that would be neat. We'll have a former congressman in, uh, somebody from my area, and I thought, oh, another walk down memory lane. That'll be nice. And I thought it would be interesting. This guy is the best friend a first responder firefighter ever had. If you are a firefighter, you know this guy. If you're EMS, you know this guy. He has spent his life advocating for firefighters and the things that they need. Um, his Project 290, which you'll see way at the other end of this presentation, is really amazing. But I had no idea what I was going to find out when I set this show up. Instead of 30 minutes in the can, a nice show, we have 2 hours of video. This is going to be a 2 or 3, possibly a 4-part show. So stay with us over the next few days. We're going to talk about 9/11. We did not get nearly as far into Maui and LA fires as I wanted to. We're going to talk about intelligence failures, serious ones. We're going to talk about DC intrigue. Now I know somebody personally. It's not just me talking, but a lot of the things you've heard, especially in the last few weeks, by coincidence, pure coincidence, are correct. So sit back, stick with us, and you'll find my next guest is probably one of the most amazing conversations you've heard in a long time. By way of introduction, I want to play a clip for you of Congressman Curt Weldon on the floor of the House.
This is the result of the process that I was pitching since 1999 to our government to implement. But the CIA kept saying we don't need it. Steve Hadley said, Congressman, I'm going to take this chart and I'm going to show it to the man. The man that he meant, Mr. Speaker, was the President of the United States. I said, Mr. Hadley, you mean that you've not seen something like this before from the CIA? This chart of Al-Qaeda worldwide and in the U.S.? And he said, no, Congressman. So I gave him the chart. Now, Mr. Speaker, what's interesting in this chart of Al-Qaeda, and you can't see this from a distance, but right here in the center is the name of the leader of the New York cell. And that name is very familiar to the people of America. That name is Muhammad Atta, the leader of the 9/11 attack against us. So prior to 9/11, this military system that the CIA said we didn't need and couldn't do actually gave us the information that identified Muhammad Atta's cell in New York. And with Muhammad Atta, they identified 2 of the other terrorists with him. But I learned something new, Mr. Speaker, over the past several weeks and months. I've talked to some of the military intelligence officers who produced this document, who worked on this effort. And I found something out very startling, Mr. Speaker. Not only did our military identify the Muhammad Atta cell, our military made a recommendation in September of 2000 to bring the FBI in to take out that cell, the cell of Muhammad Atta. So now, Mr. Speaker, for the first time, I can tell our colleagues that one of our agencies not only identified the New York cell of Muhammad Atta and 2 of the terrorists, but actually made a recommendation to bring the FBI in to take out that cell. And they made that recommendation because Madeleine Albright had declared that Al-Qaeda an international terrorist organization. And the military unit involved here felt they had jurisdiction to go to the FBI. Why then did they not proceed? That's a question that needs to be answered, Mr. Speaker.
This is the Free Zone Communique, transmitting from Virginia's unoccupied sector. If you think smart cities, DEI, censorship, government intrusion, bug paste, and other left-wing nonsense are no longer a possibility, think again. We've won one election with slim majorities. Our work to rebuild a free and sane America has just begun.
This is the Free Zone Communique, bringing hope to victims behind the wire in blue cities. I'm your host, Matt Jordan. We're going to have a big guest today. I will bring that person on in just a few minutes, but I wanted to start with a note about ARC. That's Alliance for Responsible Citizens. It has become sort of an anti-Davos convention. That's certainly not their intent. They're more significant than the people at Davos. You can't tell the people at Davos that. They think they're the most important people in the universe. But ARC is an interesting gathering. At the bottom of below the media line, I will leave a link. So you can look up the ARC. You can look at some of the videos. They're an education. You see Kissam and a few of the other speakers. I think Schellenberg was there. He was great. But I saw an interview, and this is what I wanted to bring forward, between Jordan Peterson and Nigel Farage. Nigel Farage has been made a caricature by the left-wing media. If you saw the movie Brexit, they portrayed him to be being a cartoon character, just about. A complete goofball. He's got that big toothy grin, and that's what they keyed on. That became who he was as far as the left-wing media is concerned. But he is more tuned in, more committed to his principles, and better read and better spoken than most people. It would be great if the president we have over here that I voted for were half as articulate, half as well read, and half as capable of conveying an idea, conveying their beliefs. England would be wise to bring Farage and his people on board real soon. If you've been following me on social media and on here, on the P4B, you'll know that I consider England to be practically lost to foreign religious nutbags. Joining me now is former Congressman Curt Weldon. Everybody back home knows him. And big flash for everybody out there, we're back in Delaware County.
Good old Delaware County.
It seems every time I turn around, I get another guest from Delco. People start calling this the Delco Reunion Show. The congressman has had an interesting career, and I'm going to ask him about all of it. Congressman, welcome.
It's great to be with you, and thanks to all of your viewers for getting on and listening to you and giving me a chance to share some of my experiences.
We're gonna talk about your firefighting career and your congressional career and what you're doing now, because you didn't retire from politics and lay down. I mean, you are really busy.
Yeah, well, I'm not in politics per se, but I'm not going to give up on what I know, especially with the change in administration now and them taking on the deep state. Now I feel more comfortable that I can tell what I witnessed firsthand and share it with the American people. To be honest with you, up until at this point in time, I couldn't trust that the deep state wouldn't take action. A couple of my friends that work for the CIA are dead, and I don't think it was an accident. They died mysteriously, and one of them was helping me big time, and he was actually threatened by one of the three candidates to head the CIA in a telephone conversation for working with me. And that's not a conspiracy theorist, that's the truth. The other one was my staffer who co-authored the book with me when I took on the CIA in 2005. That book was about Iran and about the fact that if we didn't deal with the lack of control of the intelligence community, we were going to end up at war with Iran. And that book was co-authored with my staffer who had worked for the CIA for 10 years. And that book was endorsed by the former director of the CIA. So for those who say, Weldon's some crazy guy, the former director of the CIA, Jim Woolsey, would not have endorsed my book publicly with a 3-page letter in 2005 while I was still in Congress, unless he had confidence in me. That book was also endorsed by Jack Caravelli. Jack Caravelli was the CIA advisor to Al Gore. So it was both parties, leaders in both parties, that publicly endorsed what I said. My problem wasn't with the political leadership in the Congress. It was with the people behind the scene who think they can do what they want and cause problems that we're now seeing in reality as it's being exposed, that I had to look at and watch for the 20 years I was in Congress. And it's not a pretty sight. And again, my best friends in Congress were all Democrats, so I'm not a partisan.
Yeah, I remember Woolsey. He was not your wide-eyed maniac type
No, he was low key.
crazy advocate. He just did his job.
Did his job. Former Navy guy. He was actually appointed by Bill Clinton. And then because Clinton wouldn't bring him in for briefings, he didn't want to hear from him. Woolsey finally resigned from the agency and was replaced. But I got along with pretty much all the CIA agents' leadership. George Tenet, I worked with. When George Tenet went in, he called me down to his office, which is very rare for the CIA director to call one member down. And I took my staffer with me who had worked for the agency, and we had breakfast together. He at the top floor of the CIA headquarters. And he had about 10 of his direct reports around the table. And he said to me in front of them, Congressman Weldon, we respect you over here in this agency and the work you've done, especially against the Soviet Union and Russia. And I want to tell you, whatever you want from this agency, they will give you. And if you don't feel like you're getting what you want, you come to me. And so that's the kind of relationship I have with George Tenet. And I could call him, and I did frequently. I had the same relationship with Leon Panetta, gave me the International Oceans Award before he became the head of the CIA. He was appointed in the Democrat administration. Porter Goss was in Congress and a former CIA director. So I got along with him. And George Bush was the president of the United States, who was the former CIA director. So it wasn't like I'm somebody out of the blue attacking the agency. There are many good people in the agency. But I got to be honest with you. As we would say in Marcus Hook, there are some scumbags in the agency, some people that don't deserve to be working for our country, that have gotten us into wars, that have caused unnecessary deaths. And that's where I really decided I'm going to come out and tell my story now.
Can you give me the name of the book?
Well, I've written several books. The first book was about the ship collision of Marcus Hook, the Corinthos disaster. And I testified before Congress when I was in my 20s. The first book I wrote in Congress is called Countdown to Terror. And that book is you can see it. The book was published by Regnery. That's a copy of the book.
Right.
The book basically on the front cover says top secret information about the next potential terrorist attack against the U.S. by Iran and how the CIA is ignoring it.
And that's post 9/11, right?
Oh, yeah, that was in 2005. That was the year before they ended my career. The CIA got angry at me. And that book was endorsed by Jim Woolsey and by Jack Caravelli.
Okay, well, let me...
2006, I wrote the book called Able Danger. I never published it. My lawyer said if I published it, they would kill me outright because that book documents the cover-up of pre-9/11 intelligence that Louis Freeh, not me, Louis Freeh came out in a Wall Street Journal editorial and on Good Morning America and said if the Justice Department would have had the information in Able Danger, we could have stopped 9/11 from occurring. So that book's not been published yet. I will publish it, but that manuscript has not yet been published. But I did give a copy of it to the New York City fire chief back in July of this year, last year, and I dedicated it to Chief Ray Downey. Ray was the fire chief of New York City Fire Department at 9/11 who was vaporized. He had been my good friend and taken me through the World Trade Center in '93 the first time it was attacked. I felt responsible for Ray's death because I let the CIA push me back on what I knew a year before 9/11 we could have and should have done, and I'll never forgive myself for doing that.
I want to go back and build the record, to demonstrate that you're not just a voice in the cold. You're not just pulling this out of your rear end. And by the way, Louis Freeh surprised me on toward the end. I always thought he was a political hack. But when he was freed up from his duties, and even before that a little bit, he started making a lot of sense, and he started speaking in a very balanced fashion. So that was a pleasant surprise. And if you go back through recent posts, anybody's free to browse. I'll try to find some links to leave below the video line. You'll see that I talk about probably the exact same things as what's in Curt's book. Nowhere near the detail, I'm sure, but the failings that led to 9/11, and not one person took it in the ass for the mistakes they made, and they should have. There should have been people swinging from meat hooks from that.
Covered up. It was covered up by the 9/11 Commission, not the commissioners. The commissioners were good people like Tom Kane and Lee Hamilton, John Lehman, good friends of mine. But the staff of the commission, you see, neither administration wanted a commission after 9/11. The Bush administration didn't want one, neither did the Clinton administration. So the staff they picked were basically loyalists politically. So they would basically control what was reported. And the commissioners weren't given all the information. So
Correct me if I'm wrong. Correct me if I'm wrong. You've been there. I haven't. Congressmen and senators do work for their own benefit. I'm not going to say they're all angels, but the real chicanery in the Capitol building exists among the staffs. Is that a correct assumption?
Well, if a member's not strong, then the staffs will set their own agenda. And staffers have their own career paths. They're looking to move up. On the Armed Services Committee, some of the staffers are looking to go work at the CIA. Some are going to work to go at the Pentagon. So if they're looking beyond someone who's only there for a 2-year election cycle, they know that that boss is not going to be there 2 years from now. So where am I going to go with my next step? So the staffers start planning their agendas separate from what their member loyalty is. Now, I'm not saying all staffers are like that, but I know staffers that were like that. When I was vice chairman of the Armed Services Committee, there were staffers running the committee who were only concerned about their own career path, not about loyalty to the members. And I fought them. And it was very difficult because, they were in key positions before I got to Congress. So to answer your question, there are many staffers who have their own agendas. Others are loyal to the members, but it's a battle. And if you don't go to Congress understanding that you have to be in control, and if you're not in control, which a lot of members aren't, then we're not going to be able to tackle the problems that this country has, because the unnamed staffers are not held accountable to the voters. The members are.
There's members that you can tell they're led around by the nose. They couldn't find their ass with both hands, and it's a shame. But let's go back. You started as a firefighter. When did you become a firefighter?
I started growing up as the youngest of 9 children in a market, so to great parents. Neither went to high school, but they were the 2 smartest people I ever met. My father was a firefighter and chief engineer of the local fire company. So were my brothers. So as the youngest of 9, when I was old enough, I got involved in the fire company, worked my way up, became a firefighter, and went to college. I was the first of the 9 to go to college. Became the president of the fire company, became the chief of the fire company, went to state fire school and became a state fire instructor, taught school during the day in Darby, and organized the county fire training center as a volunteer. So for 3 years while teaching school, I ran fire training for 80 fire companies as a volunteer. So firefighting has been a part of my life. My wife and I were both volunteers for the Red Cross, delivering blood during like all night hours. We did volunteer service. I was on the board of the Red Cross. Community service was a part of my family, and it was something we were expected to do. It was something that I was very passionate about because of my father. My father was my role model, my hero, and I followed in his footsteps.
You saw some really wild fires while you were down there. There's two in particular I want to ask you about. Make that three. My son told me to make sure I asked you about the Wade dump fire. That lunatic.
Melvin Wade bought property up in Chester, about 2 miles north of where I grew up on the waterfront. And it was near the current site of the Commodore Barry Bridge and where the soccer stadium is today. And he used that site to basically store all kinds of toxic waste materials in barrels. We had a similar project site in Marcus Hook that I had to clean up as the mayor when I became mayor. And no one really knew what was in those barrels. There was no regulation at the time. And there was a fire that occurred there before I got involved in politics. I was a firefighter. And it burned out of control for several days, and it was all toxic materials.
Right.
And I mean, the worst possible toxic materials imaginable. And these Chester firefighters, and at that time, Chester had 5 volunteer fire companies. The neighboring companies came in to help. It burned out of control. And the explosions and the vapors given off by those barrels filled with these toxic chemicals caused serious problems and deaths of volunteer firefighters that responded. It was a terrible situation. It became a hazardous waste site. It was on the national list of hazardous waste sites, and it took years to clean it up. The current site is the parking lot for the soccer stadium for the Philadelphia soccer team.
Yeah, I was told that the flames that day burnt all different colors based on what chemical was burning.
Yeah, it was. I was not at the scene of that fire because I was 2 miles away, but I remember the fire as a young firefighter, just getting started, because that fire was back in the 70s, and it was just devastating.
It was said that this guy Wade was, when it comes to handling waste, was a world-class lunatic. Whatever didn't end up in his dump was going down storm drains, into creeks for years. I remember as a kid, we used to play in the creek between Rendell Avenue and Holy Cross Cemetery up in Yeadon.
Darby Creek.
It was part of Darby Creek, yeah, and a tributary. And there were times where the bank was sandy. It was like sandy mud, the bank of this creek. And there were sections that were orange and blue and stunk to high heaven. I would recognize those smells in degreasers and other chemicals later as an adult. This was the smell that we were smelling as we're running down the creek and we're trudging through the sand, and we're seeing this orange and blue sand and this stink. And I'm wondering if that jackass didn't throw some stuff down Darby Creek, just to get rid of it.
Well, I never knew Melvin Wade. I know the story, and I read about the follow-up and the damage caused not just to the community, but to the firefighters and responders. But it was totally out of control. He went to jail. And the key important thing here is that, and the theme I want to convey to you is the firefighters are the backbone of America. There are 30,000 fire departments in this country. 85% are volunteer, and they manage 50,000 fire stations. They are, in my opinion, they best represent what America is all about. They're the heart and soul of the nation and the backbone of the country. They don't just fight fires. They're the people who rescue the cats in the trees. They pump the cellar outs when they're flooded. It's the place where you vote on election day. It's the hall you rent for your wedding reception or where the Boy Scouts meet. It's the group that organizes the parades, the celebrations, the people that raise the money for the families that are hurting, or the children that are lost. They organize the search parties. In every community, the local fire department, remember, 50,000 stations, they're the backbone of the community. And that's why when I went to Congress, I organized them nationwide. and I became their leader. By organizing the Fire Caucus, I traveled to all 50 states and became the chairman of the national group that represented firefighters in the Congress. I had 370 members of the House and Senate as my co-chairs, including people like Biden, McCain, Gore, all the top leaders, all were my co-chairs, because I had something they didn't have. I was a firefighter. And to get results, when I couldn't get the Congress to pay attention, after I went to disasters like the Murrah building bombing in Oklahoma City and the World Trade Center attack the first time in '93, a key issue was they couldn't talk to each other. The radio systems, some were on high band, some were on low band, some were digital, some were analog. And when I asked questions of my staff, I said, why is this happening? They said, because the broadcast industry, the big broadcast companies, they were using their lobbyists to block additional frequency spectrum to allow one system to be developed just for firefighter and EMS use. So what did I do? I put the word out. I said, I want some fire trucks to come to the Capitol. So on a Wednesday during a session day, I had 300 fire trucks assemble at RFK Stadium. I grabbed Steny Hoyer off the House floor, and Steny was one of my co-chairs. He's still in Congress today.
Yeah.
And he said, you crazy bastard, Weldon, what are you doing now? I said, you come with me. I put him up I took him down to RFK Stadium, put him up in the front seat of a fire truck from his district. I got up in the front seat of a truck from my own company, and we paraded the trucks two abreast down Capitol Street, and we surrounded the Capitol building on Constitution Avenue and Independence Avenue. And they parked the trucks. And at noon, I gave the signal, and they laid on the air horns and the sirens. This is before 9/11. So you had 300 fire trucks blaring their sirens and air horns. All the buildings emptied. And the members and the staffers all ran over to the Capitol parking lot where I had two ladder trucks assembled. You can see the pictures in my book about the fire service called Awakening a Sleeping Giant. And we had a tractor trailer set up with a microphone, and they jumped up on the members on the platform was standing. I said, what are we here for? We said, we're here to demand an interoperable communication system for the firefighters of America. That's today called AT&T FirstNet. It didn't happen because AT&T had money. It didn't happen because they had good lobbyists. It happened because we shook the system by the neck and said, you're going to respond to these people that protect our towns and our cities who've been taken for granted. And that was my job. My job was to do some things to wake the country up to who the firefighters really are.
Before we move on to your actual congressional career, I want to ask you about two fires. There was one when I was growing up that, the city was in terror when the refineries went up just north of the old bridge. Did you get involved? Were you called down for that? And
well, in our area in Delaware County, Marcus Hook, my hometown, was the site of the two largest refineries on the East Coast. We had the Sun Oil Refinery, which took up half the town. And we had what at that time was the Tidewater. It later became the BP refinery, which it is today. Now it's Monroe Energy. Right. So those two refineries were in the Marcus Hook area. Up the river in Philadelphia, you had another refinery, which was Arco. And that one also caught on fire. We had, as a volunteer firefighter in Marcus Hook, we had fire in the refineries all the time. We lost some volunteer firefighters going into the refineries to fight fires. Amazingly, when I grew up, we'd have a fire in the refinery, and we'd be going in as volunteers, and the workers in the plant would be running out, and they're being paid. Now that's all changed. But back then, the firefighters, they didn't care. And that's the thing about firefighters nationwide. They don't ask questions about who you are, what sex you are you gay, are you, what ethnic. If you're at risk, they're going to risk their life to save you. And they're not going to ask the question about who you are. And if this country would just realize the basic fabric of America is in a firehouse, because they're willing to help anybody at any situation. You're in a trapped car, they're going to come in and rescue you. They're going to risk their life to save you. You could be the poorest person in the city, they're going to risk their life to come in and save you. And so that's what we do with refineries. So what you're probably talking about is one of the refineries, probably at Arco, but we had numerous fires at the Sun Oil Refinery. Tanks would go up. I fought those fires. Processing units would catch on fire. The biggest one was the collision of the two ships.
Yeah, the one I was thinking about, I believe it was the Arco fire, and they actually teach it in Navy firefighting school. This was back before AFFF,
Hmm.
and they had the fire out. There was firemen walking around on the site, kicking through the old foam, the old mechanical foam, and somebody opened up a path in that foam. And whether it was a cigarette or a spark or something, you had firemen all over the site, and it was a reflash, and it all went up together. It all started again.
Yeah, that was the Arco fire. I wasn't there at the scene because that was in Philadelphia, right next to Tinicum. But I know the situation. And again, I don't know what amount of deaths occurred at that fire. I'm not sure. But I know in fires in Marcus Hook, one fire we had in the Sun Refinery, 2 firefighters died. They were both volunteers. In other fires, people were injured, but no more fire deaths. We knew going in we had to be careful because you're dealing with volatile chemicals and refined products.
Right.
But the 2 incidents I faced was the ship fire, which was the largest in America in 1975. Then
Tell me
3 years
about
later,
that one. Yeah, yeah. Tell me about that one.
I was doing home report cards at 12:30 at night, about a mile away from the waterfront, and the house shook. I jumped up, looked out the window, and I said, "It's the refinery fire." Got in the vehicle, went down, got on the truck at the station, put our gear on the driving down, and it was on the second truck arriving at the scene. The ship was fully involved. It was called the Corinthos, SS Corinthos. It was a oil tanker, Liberian flagged, with Greek crew. The Greek crew members were coming ashore, freezing cold. It was January 25th, 1975. Some of them had parts of their bodies blown off. I mean, it was terrible.
Yeah.
And so we got those crew members who couldn't speak English for the most part in ambulances. And then we went into the property, and our goal was to set up, we couldn't get on the ship because it was fully involved
Right.
from bow to stern. And it had been carrying 300,000 barrels of light Algerian crude, which it was all floating at the BP refinery. When the Edgar Queenie, which was across the river at Camden, not Camden, at Paulsboro, was making a U-turn to go upstream, it was a 700-foot long chemical carrying ship. And when she made the U-turn in the river, the captain of the ship and the river pilot got in an argument, and the bow thrusters weren't working. So she rammed the Corinthos broadside at the dock. And it caused these explosions that were 300 feet high, burned out of control. 28 people were incinerated. The crew, the captain had his wife and his family on the ship for that trip. They all died. One person died on the Edgar Queenie. So our job was to set up lines along the waterfront and protect the town from the fire entering the refinery and perhaps destroying the town. We had a lot of destruction of waterfront properties. Buildings were damaged because of the explosive force. And when we got into the refinery, it was a nightmare. I mean, there were body parts all over the place. We went up on a warehouse that was probably 500 feet from the ship, and there was a torso up on the warehouse from one of the people on the ship. It was like a war zone. And so for 3 days, we, as volunteers, ended up with 60 fire companies from 4 states. And they went to the local firehouse, Marcus Hook. We had cots set up there. They would sleep. Then when it come down on shifts to the site and man the lines to keep the fire from coming into the town, because we had no way to extinguish the fire. We tried to use foam, but the ship was in the river, so you could not put foam.
Just wash away, yeah.
Yeah, and so that didn't work. So we had to wait until the fire burned itself out. The Corinthos sunk there, and it took 3 days for that to happen. It was the biggest fire in America in 1975. I wrote a book about it called The Corinthos Disaster. Then I testified before Congress. I was in my 20s at a hearing. The congressman then was Bob Edgar, and he invited me to come down before the Energy and Commerce Committee, and I testified on maritime fire safety. Because in the book, I had 2 co-authors with me, Bobby Sides and Harry Collins, both former fire chiefs. We made recommendations about how to prevent the kind of incident we had in other towns in America. And so I did the testimony in my 20s. I also, ironically, gave a speech 50 years ago this year at the largest fire conference in America, the Fire Department Instructors Conference, in front of probably 20,000 firefighters about that fire.
How
And I
old
made
were you when you became chief? How old were you?
assistant chief, I was in my 20s.
Wow, that's really young for a fire chief. Yeah.
Well, assistant fire chief, it's you work your way up. In our department, we had two volunteer companies. When I first joined, they didn't call them chiefs. We had a captain and lieutenants, but it was equivalent of chief and assistant chief.
Yeah.
Later on, they went with a standard that was being used by the other department and changed the titles to chief and assistant chief. So I joined the fire company when I was 18, which is the lowest age I could join. And probably by the time I was 20, I guess 26, 27, I was assistant fire chief.
Yeah.
In the waterfront area where I grew up, we were the brunt of the big industry. I mean, because the people were poor, they were unorganized. That's really why I ran for mayor. I mean, grew up in the town. I was the fire chief. I was a Boy Scout troop leader. And the people in the town said we had become the national headquarters of the Pagans motorcycle gang, one of the 5 largest motorcycle gangs in America. Their national president lived in my neighborhood. I grew up with him. And they said, well, you run for mayor. Because the existing mayor was being paid off by the Pagans. At least that was the report. He was Republican. So I ran for mayor on both tickets as Republican and Democrat. And I
You do that?
Yeah, you can be nominated by both parties if the people nominate you. And so I won the Republican nomination and I won the Democrat nomination. So both times I ran for mayor, I was a nominee at both parties. And that was my philosophy in politics, was always to try to be bipartisan and not take one side over the other. There are good people in both parties. Unfortunately, when you get to the national level, the party leaders don't want you to play that game. John Sununu, who was the chief of staff to George Bush, the father,
Yeah.
I met him after I left Congress, and he said to me in his office, he said, Congressman Weldon, you were a great member. He said, but you made one fundamental mistake. I said, what's that, John? He said, when you come to this city, you either have to be on one rail or the other rail. And you went down the middle and took on both rails. And he said, you can't survive.
Right.
And he said, well, John, with all due respect, I didn't pledge allegiance to the Republican Party. I pledged allegiance to the Constitution. You guys were ecstatic when I took on Clinton and the crimes that he was involved in and committed. But when I saw similar things under Bush Jr., you didn't like it. He said, well, that's why you're not here anymore. I said, well, so be it. I said, that's okay. I said, my job wasn't to come down here and defend the Republican Party when they did bad things as well as good things.
Right.
So that's true at all levels. And that's why in our country today, we need people who are willing to stand up. And it doesn't really matter what party they are. Stand up for what's right. And that's been a problem for the last 30 years. And I saw it firsthand.
Well, while we're on the subject and we're talking about politics, did you ever, back then when you were in Washington, did you ever envision a day when we would be actually having what appear to be serious conversations on whether you can turn a boy into a girl?
Never.
Or some of these other weird things we're hearing constantly now. That's like, these are now mainstream conversations held by adults.
It's out of control. And, what I saw in Washington were strange things occurring that we have not yet had the truth about. Wait till the Epstein information comes out. Wait till the people see who were on the planes going to Jeffrey Epstein's islands and what took place there. And the other instances involved with instances involving child abuse. I never witnessed that personally, but I've seen some of the things that have been held back. And it's abuse of power. I mean, you get power and then you let it go to your head, and then you do bad things to people. Now, I saw it, when 9/11 happened, I was the vice chairman of the Defense Committee, and I was the leader of all the firefighters in the country. So I knew that we could have had information to prevent 9/11. I knew that for a fact, and I'll take a polygraph on everything that I saw and witnessed, as I've said publicly. But then because I couldn't trust the intelligence agency to give me verifiable information that I could trust. They always spun it for an agenda they wanted me to come to a conclusion on. I set up my own intel team, and I had about 20 career intelligence officers. Most of them were ex-veterans who worked for the CIA, the FBI, the DIA, the NSA, and they would meet with me off the record weekly in the Capitol restaurant, in the members' dining room, in the Capitol building.
Yeah.
And they would feed me raw data. So they were giving me raw data about emerging threats so I could, as the vice chairman of the Defense Committee, make decisions affecting how we protect our troops and how we protect our nation. So they start giving me raw data that Osama bin Laden is being cited not in Afghanistan, but in Iran.
Right.
In Iran. So they gave me a town I never heard of called Ladiz. So I walked up the street to a bookstore and I went in and bought a map. I don't know, well, where is this town? And I brought the map back to my office. I looked on the map and sure enough, there's Ladiz, 10 kilometers inside the border of Pakistan in Iran. While we're sending thousands of kids to Afghanistan. So I go to my next briefing with the agency as the acting chairman of the full committee with 60 members of Congress around me. And I asked the question, I have information that bin Laden's been cited in Ladiz. And their response? Well, Mr. Chairman, we've heard similar reports. We could either confirm or deny them. Well, that was outrageous.
Well, the arrogance now is unbelievable on the parts of all the departments.
Because they got away with it. They got away with it so long.
Yeah, I said in a recent post, Congress's job is all of the oversight. They make the laws and then they watch. And the oversight isn't a little bit, it isn't sometimes. It's their friggin' job. It's what you do. You have one friggin' job. And the departments have gotten so full of themselves that they think their job is to give Congress just enough information so they can have a nice little hearing and get some good face time on TV.
It's worse than that. It's worse than that. The intelligence agency teaches certain members of the intelligence community how to manipulate the members of Congress and their staffs, how to manipulate to get what they want as opposed to what you're saying, which is the direction of the people elected by the electorate. And they do that by intimidating members, by threatening. They'll leak information out. You know, it's illegal for me as an elected official to give classified information out to a reporter. The agency does that all the time. They'll bring in selective reporters and they'll feed them information, and then the reporter will write something from anonymous sources.
I'll make this a very short commercial break. There will be buttons and links below the audio line for all of this. Please share and subscribe. It's free. We're trying to get into all 50 states. Please, if you can, support the P4B directly with a donation. Look for the button to get your P4B gear. Also, shop Po River. That helps the site too. Any purchase you make will help us and will not cost you anything extra.
Po River, it's not just shopping, it's an experience and an excellent place to find great gifts. Visit poriver.etsy.com today and find something you'll love.
Please tell a friend about the Free Zone Communique. We live and die with the share and subscribe buttons. Please use affiliate and sponsor buttons to support our work. Thank you very much for joining us today.